Hi everyone, welcome to the August 28th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to do some handicapping of Saratoga's Saturday card. We've got 4 interesting stakes races. 3 of those are part of the late pick 5 sequence, and we'll go through all of those, the feature race obviously being the Grade 1 Forego. They're also running the Grade 3 Saranac early in the day, so we'll go through all of that. That pick 5 sequence at the end of the day, though, pretty difficult. We've got a 2-year-old Maiden race pretty late in the card, an allowance race with the New York breds to close things out, so a lot of ways to go. We'll get to all of that in a little bit. Craig, excited to talk about these races with you, and how are things going for you?
They're going well. I know you're in the same boat as me. We're about to have a really busy week with this year's delayed Kentucky Derby coming up. So this week's almost kind of like an easy one for us, but we still got plenty of good racing to talk about, and looking forward to discussing these races.
Yeah, I'm bracing myself for next week when we've got a full slate of racing at Saratoga and that Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks cards to analyze. I mean, it's going to just be a smorgasbord of excellent racing, so I'm looking forward to it, but there'll be a lot to sift through, I'm sure. And we'll get to all of that, and we'll talk about it next week. The focus today is going to be on that Saturday card at Saratoga, and let's kick things off with that third race. It's the Grade 3 Saranac going a mile on the inner turf course for the 3-year-olds. And we should say ahead of time, they already got some rain in Saratoga this week. Yesterday, we're recording this on Friday, of course, and there's more rain predicted to come tomorrow morning on Saturday, so watch the weather, and these turf races looks a little dicey as to whether they'll stay on. I imagine they're going to try to keep on both stakes races, both the Saranac and the Sword Dancer, which we'll talk about later. But in this Saranac, assuming it stays on the turf, it's a pretty wide open field. I actually had a real struggle even making a morning line in this race because it's hard to know who the favorite's going to be. A lot of these horses just have similar credentials. I imagine that 2 of the horses they'll gravitate towards are Vanzi and Don Juan Kitten. And the thing you can say about both of these horses is that they have some tactical speed, and that could be an asset in this race.
Yeah, it sure could be. And as you say, I think it's worth mentioning we're going to have to monitor the weather, see how the course turns up. As we know, even if this is kept on, it could drastically change how the turf course plays. But, I'm just going to handicap it as a turf race. I'm not going to discuss MTOs. We got a big field of 10. I think how tough the race is indicated just by your morning line. You have a tepid morning line favorite in Vanzi. He comes in from us with a big figure from me at Monmouth. It was a race with a slow pace where we kind of I used that pace adjustment to give him a really nice figure. I know you had some questions about it, but it was a fairly tough figure to make, but I do think it was a really good effort from him. I think he was dominant in that field, and I certainly wouldn't pick any of the others coming out of that same race that day. So I think he's got a real shot in here. That said, a horse shipping in from a lesser circuit coming out of a stakes race like that is not one that I want to take a shortest price in. This obviously isn't part of the pick 5. It's earlier on the card. It's part of the early pick 5, which we're not discussing. I doubt I would be playing the early pick 5 anyway, so I'm going to look at this race from a more vertical standpoint. I think if you're looking for some alternatives, the Chad Brown Imperator is a logical alternative, but there are a few question marks for me. I just stuck with TimeformUS PPs. I didn't open up Formulator today for this. But I found it interesting to see that Chad Brown has dropped to only an 89 in our ratings on that 1 to 100 scale with Euro shippers. It's interesting because Chad Brown is, for the most part, 100 almost all the time with everything, especially on turf. But while he's not having a bad meet, it hasn't been your typical Chad Brown meet. He's only rated a 95 overall for us at Saratoga. And I also noted this horse got better at longer distances when he was overseas. So maybe this is more of a prep for something. So while I certainly think he can win, he's not the one I eventually landed on. Another a lot of people might consider is 3 Techniques. He's a horse we saw on the Derby Trail. He ran in Arkansas. He ran very well on the dirt last year at Saratoga. But to me, this feels like more like a guess and a kind of we're not sure what to do with this horse. Maybe he'll take the turf than a confident move, thinking he is bred for turf. I'll get your thoughts on that when we're done, I hope, because I look to you for those sort of things. But I didn't see a lot of turf breeding personally. So that said, I landed on Don Juan Kitten as the top pick for me in here. He's improved every single start of his career. He has really good tactical speed. He got that nice 115 TimeformUS speed figure last time, which fits well in here. And I just think he's sitting on a really big race.
We see this pretty much the same way with regard to the favorites. Vanzi makes plenty of sense, and I'll just briefly touch upon what you mentioned, those concerns I had about the speed figure last time. I mean, I get the predicament that you were in, because it was one of those situations where either the rest of the field regressed a little bit, or Vanzi took a big step forward and everybody else ran their typical speed figure. I'm not really sure. The fig looks a little high for Vanzi for me, and obviously he's getting an elevated figure because you broke it out for pace, and also because he came home so quickly, and that's to the horse's credit, and he gets a pace bonus in our TimeformUS speed figures for that. So he ran a big race. I don't think there's any disputing that, and obviously he's far superior to the other horses coming out of the Jersey Derby. I think he makes sense here. I think he's going to get a good trip from the inside. Didn't think he was a standout at a short price, and of the short prices like you, I prefer Don Juan Kitten a little bit. I just think he's run well in all of his starts except for that one race at Gulfstream off the layoff, and I'm willing to forgive him for that. The rest of his races are just really good. I mean, two back, he almost beat Domestic Spending, who obviously went on to win the Saratoga Derby. And last time, there was that weird race where that horse ran off on the front end. He got there first, but still kicked on for home and held the closers at bay without too much trouble. I just think he's doing really well. He's handled given the ground in the past, so I'm not that concerned about the turf course coming up a little softer. I just think he makes a lot of sense in here. The other two horses that you mentioned that could take money, the number 3 Technique. I don't see a ton of turf pedigree. I'm sort of with you there. Mr. Speaker, while he was a winner of the Belmont Derby on the turf during his racing career, he's been a pretty poor turf sire so far. I think he's winning with just 5% of his turf starters overall, if you look up the stats in DRF Formulator. On the dam side, there's a little bit, but it's more of a dirt pedigree, so have to stand the man. I will say his last turf workout over the Oklahoma course was actually in company with two very good Chad Brown horses. I'm not sure how that came about, if they arranged that beforehand or if they just hooked up on the racetrack, but he actually was working in company with Olympico and Almanar, who are both graded stakes level horses for Chad Brown, and he held his own against both of those horses, racing in between them. So it looked like he handled the turf course okay in that workout. I'm just not sure how that's going to translate to the afternoon. So we'll see. If he's a price, maybe you take a shot with him. He just wasn't for me in this race. And Chad Brown's entrant, L'Imperator, the first-time import, you mentioned those stats in the TimeformUS PPs, and I actually went in a formulator and looked up Chad Brown's statistics in this exact situation, and I was fairly surprised. Foreign shippers on the turf that are 3-year-olds, over the past 5 years, Chad Brown is just 3 for 37, winning at 8% with a 79-cent ROI. And if you narrow that down to 3-year-olds making their first start in this country on turf in graded stakes, he's 0 for 12. So Chad Brown doesn't win with these types of horses very often at all. And this one looks like he preferred longer distances overseas. I wonder if this is a bit of a prep race for something longer down the line. So he wasn't really for me in here. The one other horse I would throw in at a price is the number 6 Big Dreaming. I know he's a little bit light on the speed figures. He hasn't faced this kind of company yet. Just watching his last couple of races at Churchill Downs and Arlington Park, seems like a horse with a lot of ability that really hasn't been... He's just superior to the horses he's running against, and that's very apparent. He only won by a length last time, but they really schooled him in behind horses, sort of made it as difficult as they possibly could for him, while still having the victory ensured once they got clear in the lane. So I think he's a horse that's going to take a step forward here. Not sure he's good enough to beat this field, but he'll be a price, so I'll throw him in underneath.
Yeah, I'm never going to knock anybody taking a price. And with these turf horses, especially 3-year-olds, sometimes figures just aren't that important. So I certainly don't have any problem with him. That was great stats on Chad Brown. I'm glad you took the time because, like I said, I haven't looked at Formulator yet this week, but it's something I always do because otherwise, in situations like this, I just feel kind of exposed and like I'm not sure what I'm doing. So I will certainly get to that, but you saved me the time on that one. And really, I'm shocked just how bad they were in this specific situation.
Yeah, I think it pays to look those up because sometimes the cool thing about stats when you look them up in Formulator is that you'll have a preconceived notion of what you expect the stat to be just based on watching the races. And sometimes it's a little counterintuitive and you have to revise your opinion of how a trainer does in certain situations and pay more attention in the future. Let's move on to that late pick 5 sequence, races 7 through 12, and it begins with 3 consecutive stakes races, kicking off in the Grade 2 Amsterdam, race 7, going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-olds. And Greg, there's an interesting pace projector in this race because when I was looking through this, it seems like there's plenty of speed on paper. You've got some horses who hooked up on the lead in the Gold Fever at Belmont, the very fast Yaupon coming off an impressive maiden allowance victory, and Premier Star who has plenty of speed. I was a little surprised to see that favors horses on under the lead characterization, though I can see how the algorithm arrived there given the PPs and some of the data for the horses and turning back in distance.
Yeah, this is a case where I'm not putting a lot of stock in that label. I don't think it's a race where we're going to get a super hot pace. We know that doesn't really happen in NYRA races very often, and it's only a 6-horse field. So I think there will be a lot of tactical riding going on. But I don't think anybody has any kind of pace edge over any of the others in here. I think it's probably going to be a rider's race with only 6 horses in here. That said, I think the winner is definitely going to come from the inside 4. The outside 2 look like pretty rank outsiders to me. Maybe the 5 could be part of the pace coming out of that Gold Fever Stakes where he was part of a pretty quick pace. But overall, I don't really consider him a contender. And that said, I don't have any real knocks on any of the 4. I could see people using any of them. We have the Basin, who is coming, off the Derby trail. He ran some decent races before kind of flopping back last time. But he looks like a horse who I think we've talked about all along. He may very well just be better at one turn. So no knocks on him. Yaupon, I guess is how you say it. I didn't watch a replay on him because I remember watching the race live. And he's done absolutely nothing wrong. Been super impressive in both starts. Nice figure last time with a 116. He probably would have to step it up, but he's shown he can probably do that if needed. I think the horse with the biggest question mark of the big 4 for the inside 4 for me is Long Weekend. Just because that last race, he's going to be one of the favorites in here, either the favorite or the second choice as you have him pegged on the morning line. And I'm not so sure. Maybe it was a slot, maybe it wasn't. I just don't like to write off a horse and put a line through a race on a horse that's going to be a sure price and assume he didn't like a wet track when there's really nothing in his past performances to say he shouldn't have liked the track. He had run well on a good track before, and maybe he's just tailing off a little bit. Maybe he'll rebound, but at a short price, I'm going to be a little skeptical. So as a vertical player, I actually am landing on Premier Star. I really liked his last race at Laurel last time. It's proven to be a strong race. He showed high speed and kept going. A couple horses from that race have already come back to win with speed figures better than they ran that day. So he's the one I like in here. I like the post position he gets. I don't think he necessarily has to go to the lead. And he's done very little wrong sprinting in his career. He has one bad race where he just had a tough start, but otherwise he's won all his sprints easily. And at 5-1 morning line, he's the one I'm going to pick on top.
Yeah, we view this race very similarly. I don't actually have a whole lot to add to your analysis. The 2 favorites, I think we have a similar take on them. Yaupon, I guess I prefer him slightly to Long Weekend just because it seems like he's in great form right now. He won that allowance race over some hardened older horses last time, and it seems like he's got a bit more versatility than Long Weekend, whereas in his maiden victory, he came from a little bit off the pace. He stalked. So I don't know if they're going to be so aggressive with him to try to get in front of Long Weekend, because you know what the plan is with that horse. Tom Amoss is going to send Long Weekend to the front. So I would imagine Yelpon's going to sit a pretty good stalking trip here. I think he's kind of the horse to beat. Long Weekend, like you, I never want to put too much stock in wet tracks. So while that is the obvious excuse last time, I am a little bit concerned about Long Weekend. It's now been a few months since we've seen him put forth one of those efforts that's going to make him the horse to beat in this race. I mean, he was really good going back to Oaklawn, but that's really the only venue where he's run races that would make him tough in here. So I'm just a little bit skeptical of him. He definitely can win this race. I won't be shocked. I just thought at a short price like you, I would take a little shot against him. I tried to make Basin. I just am not sure if he's quite good enough. He'd have to really improve on the turn back. He's probably going to get some pace to close into. Like you, though, I thought the horse that might offer the best value is Premier Star. His last race just looks totally legitimate for all the reasons that you cited. And he's a horse that's always had some ability. They tried to go long, didn't work out. He had a big excuse when he blew the start 2 back at Laurel. I just think he's coming into this race in good form. He even got a workout over a sloppy Saratoga surface last week and looked good there. So I think he's sitting on a big race, and he's going to be my pick as well.
Yeah, and I do want to mention that big figure. I know it's probably been quite a while, but we used to discuss these Laurel races, and I said I had some questions about the figures. I couldn't really figure it out. Well, I'm sure most people have read about the GPS timing, which they read at Laurel, and it certainly probably was part of the problem with the figures I was making back then. I didn't know what was going on. I was trusting the times I was getting. But now, and this includes Premier Star's last race, I'm video timing all the races from Laurel, so I don't really have any question the times are right for his race. And as I said, it's proven to be a strong race with both the 3rd and 4th place finishers coming back to it to win races with plus 100 figures, which was better than they ran that day. So no question marks for me as far as the figure goes anymore at Laurel Park.
Let's stick with the sprinters and move on to one of the features on this card, the Grade 1 Forego, going 7 furlongs for the older horses. And I've got to say, for a Grade 1 sprint race, there is not a lot of speed in this field. You see it in the pace projector. You see it just scanning down the PPs in TimeformUS and looking at the running styles of all the horses. 10 of the 11 horses in this field have running styles of mid-pack closer or plotter. So there's just not a lot of speed in here, and we'll see how that affects some of the main contenders. I will say the morning line favorite Whitmore, while he does have a reputation as of being a horse that comes from off the pace, he's got more tactical speed than most in this field, so perhaps he's not going to be that badly compromised. But I do think this is a race where you want to be forwardly placed to have your best chance.
Yeah, it's the pace projector. I was definitely kind of, looking forward to seeing it because it's a really tricky race. When you see Lexitonian up front, a horse who came from the clouds to almost win out at Del Mar last time out, it kind of tells you that there's just not a lot of speed in here. This is a Grade 1, but I would say that's a name only. I don't think this is truly a Grade 1 field, more like a Grade 2. I was hoping to see Volatile come back in here, but I assume he's probably going to run on Derby weekend at Churchill. So that said, it's a tough race. I started with horses coming out of Volatile's Vanderbilt, the 2, 3, 4 finishers all in here. But that said, I'm actually going to handicap this race like that one never happened because the pace was just so slow that day. I don't think that told us a whole lot of anything about any of these horses. But that said, I don't particularly like any of those horses in here. If I were playing a pick 5, I'm not sure I will be or not at this point. I definitely use Whitmore of those 3. I mean, he can certainly win, and I think he was clearly the best of the 3 coming out of that race. He could win here, but as a vertical player, he's not one I'm going to take a shot with on the win price at what will probably be a fairly short price. Chad Brown has a couple in here who I wanted to make a case for. Complexity, who started out his career so well and then kind of flopped in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. He's been hit or miss since then with a couple wins in allowance races, a couple losses in stakes races. But He just hasn't ever really run that fast. He hasn't improved much at all since his second career start. So it's hard for me to make a case for a horse like him. Fortin Hill comes in having done very little wrong in his career, won 3 out of 4, ran a nice 121 TimeformUS speed figure. But I wanted to make a case for him as well at 6-1. But looking through the TimeformUS chart, I'm really skeptical of that race. I couldn't find anything that pointed to the figure being tough to make, but it just come back a really weak race with all the horses who finished right in behind them just coming back and not running very well at all. So I wound up leaning in another direction. That's Funny Guy, the New York bred. He's come back as a 4-year-old and looked better than ever. He ran that 123 first time off the bench when he beat Mr. Buff. He kind of came back and backed it up when he turned back to 7 furlongs in the Morrissey. His figure regressed that day, but that was very largely a function of the pace. It was really slow. And he just did what he had to do. He was able to stay much closer when the pace was slow, which was something I always like to see because it shows how versatile he can be. And he just looks like a horse who's sitting on a huge race to me. He catches a field which isn't very strong, and I think he's going to offer value in here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating race, and there are many ways to go. It's funny that you mentioned all of the Vanderbilt horses and wanting to take a stand against them, because as I go through my picks, you'll realize I took the opposite tack. I really am leaning towards the Vanderbilt horses. I do think Whitmore is the horse to beat, and just to kind of give my thoughts on how the Vanderbilt was run, like you, I don't want to put too much stock in the race. The one thing I will say is that Whitmore had a big excuse. Obviously, he broke through the gate beforehand. There was a long delay after the start when Lexingtonian reared up and was scratched at the gate after that. So I think Whitmore was compromised by that. He also was compromised by the fact that the pace was so slow, and he was running fastest of all at the end. And I know Volatile got a lot of credit for winning that race by a length and a quarter, but I thought Whitmore ran just as well, closing into that pace, having things working against him. I didn't think Volatile was some sort of easy winner of that race. So it's hard to know what to make of it, but I think Whitmore ran well. And as for as for Mind Control and Firenze Fire, I like that they at least prove that they're still in pretty good form. I mean, we saw that for Firenze Fire in the True North 2-back. He kind of got back on track. But it was good to see Mind Control run a competitive speed figure after really bombing in the Carter off the layoff. Maybe it was the wet track Mind Control didn't like. Maybe he was just not quite ready off the layoff for that Carter. It was a tough spot, and he sort of got outrun early. But I think both of these horses, or all three of these horses rather, are dangerous in here. I'll get right to the chase, though. I'm going to make Mind Control my top pick. I just feel like he's going to get a little lost in this race. He was third in the Vanderbilt last time. People might see that sloppy track performance 2-back, and if the track comes up wet on Saturday, perhaps they're going to go against him based on that. I just think Mind Control is a really solid, hard-knocking horse who loves this 7 furlong distance. I am encouraged that he's drawn outside, so I think John Velasquez is going to be able to get relatively forward with him because he's certainly not slow. I know he's a little farther back on the pace projector because they've ridden him from off the pace in some recent races, and obviously all of the horses coming out of the Vanderbilt are not going to be helped by their position in the pace projector. But Mind Control has shown plenty of tactical speed in the past, so I do think he's quick enough to be more forwardly placed than he's shown in the pace projector. And he's run well up here before. He always runs well wherever they place him at this 7 furlong distance. So I just think Mind Control is a dangerous horse in this race that could be somewhere in that 6 to 7 to 1 range. He's my top pick, just looking for some value. I'm not against Firenze Fire. I think he's dangerous too. He's been running well enough in recent starts in the Kelly Breen barn. Complexity is the most interesting of the Chad Brown horses for me. We totally agree on Fortin Hill. I don't really see him as being a contender in this race for the reasons that you mentioned. Complexity, his last race was good. They rated him just off the pace. He really kicked home impressively, beat a good field that day. He hasn't quite stepped up to the graded stakes level since he was a 2-year-old and been competitive, but you can make some excuses for some of his races. Of all the horses in here, I think he's the one that's supposed to get sent to the front because he's run well with the lead before. Obviously, he went gate to wire in the Champagne. They're supposed to put him on the lead, and maybe that gives him his best chance and he's able to wire the field. I think that's a real possibility. I don't know if he's going to be much of a price. We'll see how they bet this race. I think he's very dangerous, though. I would mostly lean towards him and Mind Control, though, as my top 2 picks. Funny Guy, who you mentioned, is a difficult call for me because he obviously is in very good form right now. This is a big step up in class, though kind of like that Fortin Hill race that you mentioned, that commentator that he comes out of two-back where he earned a big fig, that fig isn't really holding up. And you weren't the only one that had it fast. I mean, Beyer had it a fast race too. But the horses that finished directly behind him have not come back and run particularly well. And Funny Guy did win very easily next time in the Morrissey, but even he regressed on the figure scale. And that might have just been due to the slow pace. And perhaps Funny Guy is a horse that you have to regard separately to the other horses coming out of the commentator. This is just a big step up in class because those horses he beat in the Morrissey last time would be 50-1 in here. So I'm not quite sure that I think he's this good. And also coming off those two victories, I wonder if he's going to get bet in this race. So I just didn't know what to do with him, and I thought I would go in another direction searching for better value. But obviously there are a lot of horses that can win this race.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do worry that Funny Guy is going to take a little too much money. I don't have a whole lot to add to what you said. Like I said, I do think Whitmore could win the race. It wouldn't surprise me if I did wind up playing a pick 5. He'd be one of the ones I use. I am curious with picking Mind Control. Did you consider the weather? Because I think it's very likely we're going to get a sloppy track. So if you're using a sloppy track as an excuse for him in the Carter, he may very well face it again on Saturday.
Yeah, maybe I misspoke. I wasn't saying that I was using the sloppy track as an excuse in the Carter. He ran poorly in the Carter. I don't know why. He was coming off a layoff there. It was a spot where Vekoma just sort of went fast every step of the way, and he was always outrun. I don't like to put too much stock in wet tracks because every wet track is different. The circumstances are different. If you remember on Carter Day, it started raining midway through the card. They actually left the track open for part of the day and harrowed it for Code of Honor's race, and a lot of rain really got in there, and some horses handled it, some horses didn't. I mean, Firenze Fire was another horse who just didn't show up in the Carter. Maybe both of those horses hate wet tracks. I'm not sure that I really buy that, though. I just think the Carter was a race where some horses handled it and others didn't, and the field was really strung out. So maybe this wet track at Saratoga is going to be different. I don't know, but I didn't want to make that the only excuse, and I think both of these horses are going to be fair prices.
Yeah, that's a good point you make about the track and all the tracks being different. If people who use TimeformUS will note, we actually use the C code on there for track conditions, which is something I don't use very often, but that's telling me that there was some issues making the figure. I probably broke the race out because of the way the track was being maintained during the day. I don't remember that off the top of my head, but anytime you see that C, you probably can assume that it was a race that's either broken out or maybe rated with just one other race on the card.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but I was looking through the charts that day, and there were some outlier performances, not just in the Carter. There was another dirt race later won by a George Weaver horse, Thorny Tail, and he ran a huge figure and has not nearly come back to it since, and some other horses who ran poorly in that race have come back and done much better. So I guess the point I'm making is I'm not putting too much stock in those Carter Day races, and I'm giving horses a little bit of leeway for running poorly. To wrap up the stakes action with the third leg of this pick 5 sequence, the 9th race on the card, that is the other grade 1, the Sword Dancer, going 1.5 miles on the turf course, and many familiar names in this field, Craig. We've got a lot of the horses that were coming out of the Bowling Green from earlier in this meet. Obviously, Sadler's Joy crossed the wire first that day, but was disqualified. Cross Border was put up, so Cross Border was able to maintain his unbeaten record at Saratoga. They're among the horses to beat in here. I mean, the Bowling Green horses obviously are the major players. You've got some horses also coming out of the United Nations, including the winner of that race, Aquaphobia. I think you can make a case for just about every runner in this field. It's a pretty tough race to handicap.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the two to beat are the two that finished first across the wire in the Bowling Green, Sadler's Joy and Cross Border. I actually had to go take a walk around the house, kind of think things through, because I was just leaning towards picking Sadler's Joy, and I really had to give myself a stern talking to, because I just can't do that anymore. Even though he looked very good last time despite lugging in. I mean, he certainly ran well and looked back in his top form, but he's a horse, as you've mentioned, more often than not, he finds a way to lose. Now, getting DQ'd was a new way to do it. But while I think he's a contender, I'm going to go away from him in here. You mentioned the United Nations, which is a grade 1 in status, but I really don't think it was the same quality of field as that Bowling Green, even with Aquaphobia, who got a big number that day and ran really well. I wouldn't blame anybody for taking him. How can you not with Mike Maker at these long distances? But I kind of get the feeling with him that last time was the wedding and this would be the divorce here. It's hard to say, but at the short price, if you missed him last time, that was probably the time to have him. I assume Marzo is in here to be a rabbit again for cross-border as he ran last time. It was kind of tough to see. We didn't really know that last time when we were looking at the PPs, but watching the show they do on Fox, the way he was getting warmed up, I think it was Maggie talking about him, and she pretty much told us what was going to happen, and it did. And I would assume that is what we're going to see again. But that said, I actually wound up going in a different direction in here. I'm going to lean towards the shipper, Pedro Cara. I liked what I saw from him at Belmont last year in that Jockey Club Derby Invitational. I know that race name that you love so much. That was a race dominated by shippers who kind of came over, took the money and left and have never been seen here again. But he's the first one to come back. The horses out of that race that finished in those top 3 have run decent enough overseas. I do think it was a solid group. He's clearly going to get some pace that with Marzo in here that he seemed to enjoy that day. And he's also a horse who has shown that he doesn't mind some giving the ground. He's won on some yielding turf courses and some good turf courses. So at 10-1 on your morning line, Pedro Cara kind of as the new shooter against a bunch of horses we see taking turns beating each other is going to be my top pick.
Yeah, it's a tough race, and perhaps I should have called you up to have you talk me off the ledge because I ended up picking Sadler's Joy in this race. Maybe he's going to be the favorite, but I just thought he ran well in the Bowling Green last time, and he really seems to run his best races up at Saratoga. He likes those 3 turns. Seems like that helps Javier Castellano time his late move correctly, and he timed it right last time. It just, unfortunately, he got to lugging in late, something that we haven't seen from him all the time, so I'm not too concerned about him doing it again. I just thought he ran the best race last time, and I'm going to take him again. I feel like he's got to have some good karma coming his way at this point. He really deserves another grade 1 win in the Sword Dancer after what happened last time and all of his narrow losses recently. I'm not advocating for a big price or anything. I just, going through this race, I tried to latch on to a lot of alternatives, and I'll mention some of them briefly, but I just kept coming back to the fact that Sadler's Joy just seems like the best horse in this race, and I'm hoping the best horse just wins. Cross-Border was hindered last time. Whether he was actually going to win the Bowling Green or not is debatable. I'm a little concerned about the stretch out further to 1.5 miles. I'm not sure that more distance really helps Cross-Border turn the tables on Sadler's Joy, so I found it hard to take him again. I agree with you about the United Nations horses. Well, before I get to that race, I will say the one other horse I would not discount out of the Bowling Green is Channel Maker. He was also compromised when there was that bumping in the stretch, and Channel Maker just seems to always get forgotten these days, and he still has some good races in him, and he's going to sit a good trip stalking Marzo. So I think Channel Maker is another horse to use that'll offer some more value. I actually made him my second pick in this race. As for the United Nations horses, we pretty much agree. I didn't think that was a particularly strong field. Aquaphobia just got a perfect trip from Joe Bravo that day, saving ground every step of the way, got out with plenty of time in the stretch. So I didn't want him. I actually thought Corelli might have run the better race in the United Nations because he was wider on the turns and sort of got there and maybe was compromised by ground loss in the late stages. So I would prefer him coming out of that race at a better price. I've seen a lot of people making the case for Pedro Cara, so maybe he's not going to be 10-1. I don't know how they're going to bet this race. He wasn't really for me in here. I don't know. I didn't love that Jockey Club Derby. I know that it got a big figure, and it's hard for me to know how true that figure is because it was just dominated by European horses who are pretty good. They're not really necessarily graded stakes horses, but they're pretty good. And we had the other American horses in there pretty much running their same races as usual, similar speed figures to what they had run in surrounding starts. if you told me that figure was 10 points lower and that all those American horses regressed at the 1.5-mile distance, I would believe you. I just don't know. I watched Pedro Carra's recent race in Qatar. I didn't think he ran that well in there. I thought Standard Deviation ran much better, and it's not like he's done very well in this country since then. So I don't know. I know Pedro Carra might be helped by some give in the ground. He wasn't for me. If he's a price, then forget everything I said. I'm not knocking him because I don't want to be against a horse's 10-1 that you think is interesting. Go for it. But I just couldn't get to him in this race, and I landed on my old friend Sadler's Joy.
It's interesting you brought up Channel Maker. He's a horse that's almost he always seems to have trouble, doesn't win very much. 3 of his 5 career wins came in a tight span. I think it was 3 out of 4 races or something like that, and one of them was in a dead heat. But what's interesting to note is that Grade 1 Hirsch Classic he did come over a soft course. So if we do get that on Saturday, it might be worth taking note of that. And I say soft, it was labeled soft, and also on our track condition ratings, it was down as a 5, so it definitely was a turf course with a whole lot of give in it.
Now, the NYRA Racing Office did a very good job of carding a bunch of interesting dirt races on this card. So if it is an off-the-turf day, it's not like the fields are going to be decimated. It's really going to hold together pretty well. But one of the consequences of that is that they have to card these 2-year-old maiden races somewhere. Unfortunately, one of them is toward the latter part of this pick 5 sequence, so we're not going to be able to see who's live on the board before betting it. And this 10th race, the 4th leg of the sequence, does feature plenty of first-time starters. I'll start off. Pletcher has 1, Chad Brown has 2. I'm not going to be surprised if any of them are live. I'll be honest, I watched some of the workouts and I had trouble getting a feel for really who was going to be betting here, and you can probably guess that by just looking at the morning line I set for this race. I made Zainalara the slight favorite, the $1 million yearling purchase for Shadwell Stable. She worked in company with Always Karina last time. Frankly, I think Always Karina's working a little bit better. I just wondered if Irad Ortiz being named on Zainalara might cause some of the public to go in that direction instead. She's bred to be a dirt horse for sure, although she's by Warfront. There's plenty of dirt breeding on the dam side, some graded stakes horses in the mix. Always Karina's actually a half to Structor, and the dam's a half to More Than Real. Structor was the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf winner from last year. More Than Real was a Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf winner from about a decade ago. So there is turf pedigree for Always Karina, but it seems like she's working really well in the dirt. So neither one of those will surprise me. Neither will Jouster for Pletcher. Ultimately, I think some of the horses with experience are maybe more interesting, but how did you see this one, Craig?
I saw it a little opposite. I wasn't very interested in the horses who have run before. I did want to get your opinion on Ogotten Girl, who ran pretty well on turf first out, moves to dirt this time. So I was curious what you thought of her, but she did so at a huge price. So wasn't completely sure what to make of that one. This race is probably the reason I wouldn't play a pick 5 in here, just because it's so wide open. Unless I could really narrow my ticket down in some other legs, I would have to go wide in here. If I was going to, I would focus on the firsters you mentioned from Todd Pletcher and Chad Brown, which is 3 of them. I think if you just take those 3, you probably have a 60 to 70% chance to win this race. Maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe more like 50% when I think about it, but it's certainly better than the 3 out of 9 that you would just be taking blindly. But these aren't really the kind of races that are up my alley. I mentioned on Twitter it was an odd placement, and a couple people were like, "Oh, what are you complaining?" I'm not complaining. I just said, I said it was an interesting placement. I'm sure it had something to do with the weather and with some TV scheduling. They want to get the stakes races in a certain time slot. So I didn't have a complaint with it. I'm sure it wasn't just haphazardly thrown in as the 4th leg, but as a bettor, it's one that makes this a tough sequence for me and one that I'm likely to pass.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. It does make it tougher. To touch upon briefly some of the horses with experience, I think one in particular is interesting, I should clarify. Spun Détat, I think, would have to improve, and I didn't love her last race. It came up pretty slow. The horse on the outside, Rookery, I think she's coming out of a pretty weak race as well, though Wayne Catalano is not really known for having firsters fire, so I think that one is a candidate to improve, though she'd really have to do so. the one with experience that really interests me is the one that you mentioned, the number 7 Ogotten Girl, and she's actually my top pick in this race. It feels like they were giving her a prep last time because she took no money. She doesn't really have any turf pedigree. I mean, she's by Competitive Edge, who's proven to be much more of a dirt sire so far and a win early dirt sire. The Dam side is really more dirt sprint oriented, maybe a little synth in there. But it feels like maybe she was just getting a prep, and she actually ran better than expectations would have you believe. I mean, she was in a pretty tough field. That Invincible Gal for Graham Motion, who won that race, seems talented. There was a Mike Maker horse who got bet in there who was 4th. And she hung right with them. She was inside on the turn, got shuffled back a bit, stayed on pretty well while never changing leads in the stretch. I liked that effort. And since then, she's come back, and I was encouraged by her last workout over the main track at Saratoga. I think she's going to handle the dirt just fine. And if she merely transfers that speed figure to the dirt, she's going to be tough in this race. And if she takes a step forward, she's probably going to win. So we'll see how they bet this race. We'll see if the firsters take money or if she's a bigger price than I've got her pegged. Like I said, I didn't have a lot of confidence in this line. I just think that she's the interesting horse in here. So I put her on top, and I would use her mostly with the firsters.
Yeah, see, that's why I pay you the big bucks to do this podcast. Hopefully everybody realizes that is a joke.
We do it out of our mutual enjoyment. Let's close out this sequence in the 11th race, and it doesn't get a whole lot easier here. It's a New York bred allowance, nominators of 1, going 6.5 furlongs. Looks like there are 3 horses that kind of stand out just for the fact that they have had less chances than the rest and they've shown some promise. I guess the favorite's going to be the number 3 Eloquent Speaker, who just didn't want to go the 9 furlongs last time. That seemed like an odd placement for her. She's getting back to the right distance here. I will say the one thing that concerns me about Eloquent Speaker, and the only reason I did not pick her on top in here, is because she was entered on August 12th in a race at this level where I had her like 4 to 5 on the morning line. It looked like she couldn't lose. It was actually that race that Kinky Socks and Bustin' Scones come out of. Just a much weaker race at this level, and she was a vet scratch. So it seemed like something must have happened because I doubt the connections would have chose to scratch out of that race where she was almost sure to win, and now they're in a much tougher spot. So I wonder about that a little bit. Maybe I'm making too much out of nothing, but just a slight reservation on a horse that's probably going to be the favorite.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to mention most of the same horses in here. I saw the same thing you did with Eloquent Speaker. She comes in with the best figure last time from a route. It's a logical turn back after tiring that day. But, that said, I don't love her. She can certainly win, but as a horse that's going to be bet pretty heavily, she doesn't have all the stuff I want. And these are the kind of races I like as a speed figure guy. I mean, I like most races as a speed figure guy, but it's one where I can really focus on the speed figures because I think they're more important and in some other spots in races like this. A couple others that I saw in here, Flashpack and Barbie has run both times this year. She comes in our PPs with back-to-back 95s and now comes back 3rd off the layoff. Normally that's something I like, but in this case, I think it could go either way with her. She's a horse who both of her wins, one came as a first-time starter, the other off a long layoff. So if I had to decide which way do I think she's going to improve or regress, I would say it's more likely than not she's going to regress. So that leads me to my top pick, who no big surprise here, but would be Midnight Surprise. I thought she ran really well first time out, which isn't a surprise. She steps up in class logically to the next condition. It's not usually the kind of horse I love, but the runner-up did come back to win Wednesday nicely with an improved speed figure. That's not in the charts, but it will be later on today. But you can see that she won pretty easily, and I just think she has some upside. If there was a horse I was going to be interested in at a price, it would be Miss Jimmy, who ships in from Finger Lakes. She's been very good there, running figures that would be competitive. I'm not all that familiar with trainer Bruce Anderson. I know him a little bit. I haven't had time to look him up in Formulator, and something I'll do. And that will certainly go into my decision of how heavily I use this horse in here, because she's surely going to be a price coming out of Finger Lakes. But I'd like to see something a little positive when I look up his stats.
Yeah, I had some trouble with this race because there are things to like about all 3 of those favorites that you mentioned. I couldn't really latch on to any of them. I put Eloquent Speaker highest up in the hierarchy of the horses that I would use from that group, just because she seems so logical, and she is likely to improve on that turn back as long as she's doing well. Like you, the one I preferred the least was Flashpack and Barbie. I just think she's coming into a tougher spot here than the one she exits, and this could be a tougher pace scenario with Eloquent Speaker likely to show speed and Midnight Surprise showing speed to the outside. So I was a little against her. I've got no problem with Midnight Surprise. She's going to have to improve, but she certainly has the right to do so in her second career start. I just thought there were two other horses at bigger prices that were pretty interesting. One of those is the number 5, Firenze Freedom, who is actually the half-sister to Firenze Fire. She has not shown herself to be that good yet, but she did show some promise as a 2-year-old. I know she's coming out of the Jason Service barn, but we've seen Kelly Breen have some success with these horses. And she just ran well enough as a 2-year-old in a few races to suggest if she's taken a step forward with routine improvement now as a more mature 3-year-old, she could have a say in this race. I thought she got some subtle trips in a few races. She was actually compromised by getting steadied at the top of the stretch in the Maid of the Mist. Didn't run as well as at Aqueduct after that, but I still think this filly might have a step forward in her at a price, so I'd use her. And my top pick in this race is actually the number 12, Stretch the Story, who is one that might be easy to overlook at first glance because she looks like a turf horse who's now making the switch to dirt, but I would argue that maybe the best race that she's ever run was her one dirt race that was rained off the turf for Christophe Clement last year. She seems like more of a sprinter, so I don't know that she actually improved going the mile. Just think maybe she stepped up on the dirt that day, and that was not a terrible field. Antoinette, who won that race, has since proven herself to be capable on both dirt and turf. And the speed figure came back decent enough. If there's an 89, that was as a 2-year-old. So if she's improved at all now as a 3-year-old since then, she can certainly take a step forward. She came back off a layoff this year with 2 turf races for Christophe Clement. Just got going too late, going the 5.5 last time in a race that was mostly dominated towards the front end. Didn't think that she really got the right trip 2 back either. But I just like her getting back to the dirt here. She's making her first off the claim for Ed Barker, who, if you look up the stats, doesn't have great statistics first off the claim, but if you kind of dig through in Formulator, a lot of horses for this barn have run well first off the claim, even in finishing second and third at big prices, so he can certainly get horses to outrun their odds, and I just think she's an interesting horse that's going to get somewhat lost in this race.
Yeah, as a speed figure guy, both of the horses you mentioned are ones that have an angle that I like going for them, and that their dirt figures are from when they were much younger. Firenze Fire doesn't have a dirt race since January when she ran an 88. She had actually run an 89 back in October. Stretch the Story hasn't run since December on dirt when she also ran an 89. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're somebody that's using speed figures, is these horses were 2-year-olds, or in Firenze Freedom's case, a very newly turned 3-year-old. So don't expect them to run those same speed figures. I mean, they could easily run 10, 12 points faster if they come back ready to go on dirt.
Well, I hope we gave out some pretty good opinions on this podcast. We'll see. I know we each like some prices in a few races. Craig, I know you expressed a little bit of hesitation about whether or not you were going to play this. It does look like a really tough sequence. Frankly, I mean, I could do a bit of a recap, but I'm not really sure where I'd want to lean. I think there are multiple horses in every race. Perhaps the Sword Dancer, I'd lean on Sadler's Joy a little bit, and maybe in the Forego, I'd go mostly towards Complexity and Mind Control, but these seem like a bunch of spread races to me.
They do, and that maiden race definitely causes some headaches. So for the most part, I think I'm going to be playing these races vertically, one at a time, particularly in the ones where I like some price horses and don't care for the favorites. This probably won't be a horizontal day for me.
Well, if you're playing this weekend, good luck. Hopefully the weather doesn't mess with things too much, but even if it does, I think these are still some pretty interesting races on Saturday, with whether they're soft turf courses or a few of them are off the turf. It's a really interesting card, so check it out, and hopefully we helped you out a little bit. So thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS Pacecast next week.